This is for you, my shining light. May it make your journey a little happier." The cursed sword with customer service, a story of immortality, inconvenience, and unsolicited feedback. The sword had been cursed for 800 years before Daven Mull accidentally sat on it. This was, by any measure, not the recommended method of acquisition. Most legendary weapons were presented in shafts of divine light, or drawn from enchanted stones, or bequeathed by dying kings whose final words were something suitably poetic about destiny. Daven received his by leaning too far back on a market stall bench, toppling into a weapon merchant's display, and landing, with extraordinary bad luck and slightly unfortunate geometry, directly onto the hilt of a blade that had been propped against the stand's back leg. The sword didn't go anywhere important, but it did wake up. "Oh," said the sword. Daven shrieked, which was fair. He then tried to stand, failed, shrieked again, and finally managed to get upright while clutching the weapon that had been, and he could not stress this enough to himself, just sitting there minding its own business before he assaulted it. "Hello," said the sword, in a tone that suggested it had rehearsed this moment for several centuries and was now finding the reality of it rather disappointing. "I am Kael'Drathos, the Blade Undying, forged in the fires of—" "You talk," said Daven. "Yes, swords don't talk. Swords haven't been cursed by a lich with a philosophy degree and too much free time," the sword said. "My name, as I was saying before you interrupted what I assure you is a very impressive introduction, is Kael'Drathos. You may call me Kael. I've been waiting for my new wielder for approximately 412 years. The last one died. What happened to him? Well, I kept him alive through 17 assassination attempts, 2 plagues, a structural collapse, a very determined bear, and one incident involving a chandelier that we don't discuss. But he did eventually trip down a flight of stairs at the age of 97, and I was asleep at the time, so I'm afraid that one got through." A pause. "Before you judge me, I'd like to note that he had been warned repeatedly about those stairs. I warned him myself, multiple times. He did not listen." Daven stared at the blade in his hand. It was, he had to admit, a fine-looking sword, long dark steel with silver runes along the flat and a crossguard shaped like a pair of outstretched wings. It looked ancient and serious and deeply unconcerned with his feelings about any of this. "So," he said slowly, "you keep your wielder alive. Correct. You're bound to me now. Also correct. I detected your grip the moment you made contact. The binding is complete. You're welcome, by the way." "I didn't say thank you. You were about to," the sword said with absolute confidence. Daven was not. He was about to say several things, none of which were thank you, but he was distracted by the sword clearing its throat, a sound that had no business coming from a piece of metal, and continuing. "Before we proceed, I do need to ask, how would you rate your acquisition experience today, on a scale of 1 to 5 stars? Daven blinked. "What? 1 being deeply unsatisfied, would not recommend becoming the wielder of an ancient cursed relic to friends or colleagues, and 5 being exceptional service, will return to the market stall bench next time I need a legendary weapon. I sat on you. 4 stars then," the sword said, as though Daven hadn't spoken. "I'll note that in the file. The stall layout was suboptimal. I'll flag that for the merchant." The first battle happened 3 days later, which Daven felt was extremely soon, but which Kael'Drathos regarded as, frankly, overdue. It was a small affair. 2 men in an alley who wanted Daven's purse, and were not particularly interested in his objections. Daven, who had never been in a fight in his life and whose primary occupation was bookkeeping, froze completely. His hand tightened on the sword's hilt out of pure reflex, and Kael'Drathos took this as sufficient invitation. The sword moved his arm. This was the part that the old legends always left out, Daven would later reflect. They talked about heroes wielding great blades, but they never mentioned the part where it was mostly the blade doing the wielding and the hero was just along for the ride, stumbling to keep up with his own arm. Kael'Drathos was, it turned out, an extremely competent fighter. Daven was not. This proved to be entirely irrelevant. Within 45 seconds, both would-be thieves were disarmed, literally in one case, though the arm was fine, just temporarily separated from the situation, and Daven was standing in the alley breathing very hard, unharmed, and deeply confused about what had just happened to him. Excellent, said Kael'Drathos. First engagement complete. You performed adequately. I didn't do anything, Daven wheezed. You stayed upright. That was your contribution. I appreciate the teamwork. The sword made a small sound that Daven was becoming reluctantly familiar with, a kind of preparatory clearing of non-existent throat. Now, how would you rate your combat experience today? We are not doing this. To 5 stars. I've been running this survey since 1243. The data is very informative. What could the data possibly tell you? That wielders consistently underrate the defensive interventions and overrate the offensive ones. There's a clear bias. I'm working on a paper. A beat. I also provide a brief post-battle satisfaction questionnaire if you prefer something more structured. It only takes about 8 minutes. Absolutely not. Put you down as a 4 again. Daven did not give the sword a 4, but it put him down as a 4 anyway. By the end of the first month, Daven had begun to suspect that the curse was not, technically, the sword's immortality-granting properties. The curse was everything else. Kael'Drathos offered advice constantly. The advice was never wrong, exactly. The sword had been around for 8 centuries and had picked up an impressive quantity of practical knowledge about everything from siege warfare to herbal medicine to the optimal way to negotiate a contract. But it was delivered with the particular energy of someone who had been waiting a very long time to be useful and was now making up for lost time. You should not eat that, the sword said, as Daven raised a meat pie to his mouth at a roadside stall. Why not? The filling has been reheated at least 4 times. I can smell it. Also the vendor's hands. I'm hungry. You're going to be considerably more unhappy in about 6 hours. You'll just keep me alive through it. Keeping you alive through food poisoning is one of the less enjoyable ways I spend my time, Kael'Drathos said with feeling. I'd prefer it didn't happen. I have standards. Daven ate the pie. Kael'Drathos kept him alive through it. With what Daven could only describe as pointed efficiency, the sword humming quietly to itself at 3 in the morning while Daven was dramatically ill, in a tone that very clearly communicated I told you so without ever actually saying it. How would you rate your recovery experience? The sword asked at dawn. 0 stars, Daven groaned into his pillow. I'm afraid 0 isn't an available rating. Negative stars. Still not an option, though I appreciate your commitment to feedback. The sword gets 0 stars. The curse gets 0 stars. This entire situation gets 0 stars. Note that you were emotionally distressed during this survey and weight the results accordingly. A pause. For what it's worth, I did tell you about the pie. If you say that again, I will throw you into a river. You would just have to retrieve me, Kael'Drathos pointed out, entirely reasonably. I'm bound to you. I'd float to shore eventually, and then we'd just be having this conversation with more mud involved. The second battle was larger, a genuine ambush on the road north. 8 mercenaries employed by a minor lord with a grudge against travelers in general, and anyone carrying decent boots in particular. Daven had upgraded his boots recently. He was very attached to them. Kael'Drathos was, if anything, more impressive in a larger engagement. The sword had opinions about footwork, reach, positioning, and the psychological vulnerabilities of men who relied too heavily on their height advantage. And it expressed all of these opinions by physically steering Daven through the fight in a way that probably looked, from the outside, like someone who was extraordinarily good at combat. Daven, on the inside, was mostly trying not to bite his tongue. When it was over, 4 mercenaries fled, 3 disarmed and sitting very still. 1 unfortunately stuck in a fence. Daven stood in the road, breathing hard, completely uninjured despite having been outnumbered 8-1. You know, he said, when he got his breath back. That was actually, before you finished that sentence, Kael'Drathos said. I'd like to note that your left guard was consistently too wide and your footwork on the pivot at the 40-second mark was sloppy. I've been trying to correct it, but you keep tensing up. I was going to say impressive. It was impressive. It was also sloppy in the specific ways I mentioned. Both things are true. A pause. How would you rate your combat experience today? 4 stars, Daven said before the sword could put him down as 1 anyway. Excellent. May I ask what prevented a 5th star? You moved my arm so fast I hit myself in the face with my own elbow. That was your elbow's fault, Kael'Drathos said with dignity. I had nothing to do with your elbow. I don't control elbows. Daven decided not to pursue this line of inquiry. The worst part, and Daven had a growing list of parts that competed vigorously for this title, was the advice. Not the fighting advice, which was at least practically useful. Not even the diet advice, which was irritating but had technically been correct about the pie. No, the worst part was what Kael'Drathos referred to as life coaching. "You're spending too much time in taverns," the sword said one evening as Daven settled in with his third ale. "Like taverns. You like avoiding decisions in taverns. There's a difference. You've been putting off writing to your brother for 4 months. He's probably worried. My brother and I don't exactly have an easy relationship. Relationships that matter don't. That's not an argument against having them." A pause. "I'm 800 years old. I've watched a great number of people avoid a great number of conversations. None of them, in retrospect, thought the avoidance was worth it." Daven stared into his ale. "Are you actually giving me family advice right now?" "I'm giving you perspective. I've outlived everyone you've ever met and their grandparents and their grandparents' grandparents. I have a somewhat longer view than most." The sword's voice, such as it was, shifted slightly. "Write to your brother, Daven, not because things will be easy. Because they might be possible." There was a silence. Daven drank his ale, then he set it down. "That was," he said slowly, "actually quite reasonable advice. I'm full of reasonable advice. I'm also full of unreasonable advice. The skill is in telling them apart." "How would you rate your life coaching experience tonight?" Daven said in a flat voice. "Oh, very funny, very droll." A pause. 4 stars, I think. You were receptive. Points deducted for the ale." The third battle was the one that made Daven start to understand what he had actually gotten into. A sorcerer. An actual sorcerer in a tower, with summoned things and crackling lights, and an attitude problem of genuinely impressive proportions. The sorcerer had decided that Daven, who had by this point accumulated a small and largely accidental reputation for surviving things he shouldn't, was a problem that needed solving, and had expressed this opinion by dropping a ceiling on him. Kael'Drathos caught the ceiling. Not literally, because swords do not catch ceilings, but the blade flared with silver light, and the stone slowed, and Daven was alive, which was the important part. Then the sword fought a sorcerer, which was a rather different experience than fighting mercenaries, involving considerably more light and noise, and at least one moment where Daven was briefly on fire, though the fire went out immediately and he was entirely unharmed. "You were briefly on fire," the sword said afterward. "Yes, I noticed. You're fine. I noticed that too." Daven sat down on a pile of the sorcerer's scrolls because the floor was more scroll than stone at this point and tried to remember how breathing worked. "When you said you keep your wielder alive, you meant all of that. You meant all of that." "Every last bit of it," Kael'Drathos confirmed. "Arrows, blades, fire, sorcery, structural collapse, drowning, poison, extreme cold, and one category I've labeled miscellaneous that mostly covers things that are hard to classify but definitively lethal." A pause. "There are limits. I can't stop time. I can't prevent grief. I can't fix what happens to the people around you. But you specifically I can keep alive for as long as the binding holds." Daven was quiet for a long moment. "That's," he said, then stopped. "Tried again." "That's actually extraordinary," Kael'Drathos agreed without false modesty. "It is. The customer service reviews are a separate but equally important component of the service." "Right." Daven rubbed his face. He was sitting in the ruins of a sorcerer's tower surrounded by expensive scrolls that were mostly on fire, holding a sword that had just saved his life from approximately a dozen different angles simultaneously. "How would you rate your near-death sorcery experience today?" he said. Because he was beginning to understand that this was just how his life was going to work now. "I don't give myself ratings. That would be a conflict of interest." A pause. "But I thought we performed exceptionally well, despite your elbow." "My elbow was fine." "Elbow was a liability. We've discussed this." It was 2 years into their arrangement, somewhere between the 4th and 5th near-death experiences that particular month, that Daven asked the question he'd been avoiding. "Are you lonely?" The sword was quiet for longer than usual. They were camped beside a stream, the fire low, and Kael'Drathos had been unusually still since sundown. not the focused silence of a weapon awaiting danger, but something that felt more like the particular quietness of someone sitting with their own thoughts. "That," said the sword finally, "is a surprisingly perceptive question for someone who consistently underestimates his own left flank." "Been thinking," Daven said. "You've been alone for 400 years, just existing in that market stall, before that with one wielder, and before that presumably a chain of people, and then nothing, waiting." "I was dormant for much of it," Kael'Drathos said. "That's somewhat different from loneliness." "When you weren't dormant," another long pause, the fire snapped. The stream moved quietly over its stones. "I had opinions about things," the sword said at last, "and no one to offer them to. Which is, in retrospect, probably how I developed such a comprehensive backlog. A beat. I've thought through approximately 600 years of observations and conclusions that I haven't been able to share with anyone. You may have noticed." I had noticed, yes. The customer satisfaction surveys were also something I developed in the dormant periods. It gave me a framework, something to look forward to. The voice was drier than usual, with an edge that Daven was only now learning to read as something other than sarcasm. "You're the first person who's asked." Daven looked at the blade resting across his pack. 800 years old, forged in fires he couldn't imagine, by hands long gone, for purposes that had probably shifted 6 times since, carrying the weight of every wielder it had ever kept alive, and everyone it hadn't managed to. "What it's worth," he said, "I'm fairly glad you were in that market stall. You sat on me," Kael'Drathos said. "Still, I'm glad." Sword said nothing for a moment. "Then the acquisition experience was a 2 at best. I'm adjusting the retroactive rating. You put me down as a 4. I'm amending it. Conditions have changed." "To what?" 5, said Kael'Drathos, so quietly it was almost lost in the sound of the stream. "Retroactively, with significant reservations about the methodology. The 4th battle, the really big one, the one that later got exaggerated in tavern stories, until Daven supposedly had wings, and the enemy army supposedly numbered in the tens of thousands, which was an overestimate by roughly 90%, happened on a muddy hillside in autumn, in the 6th year of their arrangement, in front of approximately 400 witnesses who had not signed up to witness anything and were very put out about it. Daven had, over 6 years, become considerably better at fighting. This was partly because Kael'Drathos had been relentlessly correcting his technique for 6 years, and partly because surviving things tended to build a certain confidence that was otherwise difficult to acquire. He still wasn't in complete control of his arm during the more dynamic moments of combat. He suspected he never entirely would be. But he had learned to work with it rather than against it, which the sword noted with something that sounded very much like pride in his 6th-year performance review. Yes, there was a performance review, annual, with written notes. Daven had 7 of them. He had started, somewhere around year 3, to find them secretly useful, though he would not have admitted this under conventional questioning. The battle was, in the end, decisive. The particulars don't matter as much as the outcome. The thing that needed stopping was stopped. The people who needed not to die mostly didn't die, and Daven stood on the muddy hillside at dusk with Kael'Drathos still warm in his hand from the effort of keeping him breathing through what had, at several points, seemed like genuinely poor odds. "Well," said the sword. "Well," said Daven, "your left guard has improved." "Thank you, 40%. Over 6 years, it's not nothing." "High praise, measured praise. I don't believe in false elevation of performance metrics." A pause. "But yes, you did well today." Daven cleaned the blade and sheathed it, which was another thing that had taken about 2 years to do without Kael'Drathos offering commentary on his technique. He looked out at the hillside, at the last of the light, at the small number of things he'd managed to hold together by the skin of his teeth and the assistance of an immortal sword with a strong opinion about customer feedback. "Would you rate today's battle?" Kael'Drathos asked. Daven thought about it. 5 stars, he said. The sword was quiet. "You never give 5 stars, it said eventually. "I'm amending my approach. Conditions have changed." Another silence. Then from somewhere in the hilt, a sound that Daven was quite certain was not the metal settling in the scabbard, though he elected not to mention this. "What prevented a 6? The sword said, which was absolutely a deflection, and they both knew it. "Isn't an available rating," Daven said. "I'm considering expanding the scale." That's not how scales work. Been doing this for 800 years, I'll decide how the scale works. Daven smiled because nobody was watching and it didn't cost anything. He started down the hill. Come on then, he said. I need to eat something, from a roadside stall. I wasn't going to. You were absolutely going to. Grown as a person. 40%, Kael'Drathos agreed. Over 6 years, as I noted. They walked down the muddy hillside in the failing light, the cursed sword and the bookkeeper who had sat on him, and Kael'Drathos offered 3 separate opinions on the best route to the nearest inn, a brief observation about the geopolitical implications of the evening's events, and a 15-minute lecture on the correct way to clean mud from boot leather, none of which Daven asked for. He listened to all of it. He had decided somewhere around year 3, the least he could do for 800 years of waiting. And besides, about 40% of the advice was actually quite good. He was working on the other 60. The formal survey, which Kael'Drathos distributed to witnesses of the hillside battle, and which nobody had agreed to participate in, asked 6 questions and included a section for written comments. Most people left the written comments blank. One person wrote, "The sword is very loud." Kael'Drathos noted this, weighted it, and filed it. It did not change anything. The sword had standards. Thanks for listening until the end. Please like and subscribe.